Asahd had toiled in his master's field for several years as a slave. Moved by his unquenchable thirst for freedom, he entered a special agreement with his master. For 7 long years, he had honored this contract with his master, Kabir. Asahd vowed to perform the work of 10 men each year for a decade in exchange for his liberty. His back bore the weight of this monumental task, but his spirit remained unbroken. However, fate had a cruel twist in store. In the 7th year of Asahd's relentless labor, calamity struck Kabir. A devastating fire consumed the storehouse, reducing the season's harvest to ashes. As if that were not enough, Kabir fell prey to unscrupulous business partners, losing a fortune overnight. These misfortunes cast a dark shadow over Asahd's path to freedom, threatening to derail his hard-earned progress and plunging both men into an uncertain future. How would Kabir's loss affect Asahd's quest for freedom? Let's find out. Devastated and facing financial ruin, Kabir found himself in a dire situation. With all of his wealth gone, the only thing he had left was his slaves. And even they could not provide him with the means to pay the king's tax on land and tenements. As the king demanded payment of the overdue tax on land and tenements from Kabir, he realized that he had no means to satisfy the debt. With all of his wealth gone and no other recourse, Kabir faced the grim reality of the king's punishment for debtors. The king's guards arrived at Kabir's estate, ready to enforce the king's decree. Kabir knew that he had no choice but to comply, but he also knew that he couldn't bear the thought of being taken away as a slave to serve in the king's construction projects. The king's guards arrived at Kabir's estate. Kabir was already in chains, having been taken into custody for his failure to pay the overdue tax on land and tenements. With his fate sealed, Kabir knew that he had no choice but to comply with the king's decree. The king's punishment for debtors was well known throughout the land. Those who could not pay their debts to the king or their finest slave were taken as slaves to serve in the king's construction projects. In most cases, the interest rates imposed by the king were so high that anyone taken in exchange for the debt was considered lost, unlikely to ever regain their freedom. Understanding the severity of the punishment, Kabir made a desperate plea to the king's guards. "Take one of my slaves in my stead," he implored, his voice filled with desperation. "I cannot bear the thought of leaving my estate in ruins." The guards, recognizing the value of Kabir's offer, carefully considered their options before turning their attention to Asahd. Recognizing Asahd's strength, diligence, and unwavering work ethic, they knew that he was the best choice to salvage what remained of Kabir's estate. Reluctantly, Kabir nodded his approval, knowing that Asahd was his best hope for avoiding financial ruin. And with a heavy heart, Asahd was taken away by the king's guards, his dreams of freedom shattered in an instant. The king's construction site was a harsh and unforgiving place, a veritable hell on earth where the unlucky souls who found themselves trapped within its walls toiled day in and day out with little hope of escape. Set deep underground, the construction site resembled more of a dungeon than a place of labor. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and despair, and the walls echoed with the sounds of moans and cries of anguish. War captives and prisoners alike were subjected to the cruelest of punishments, forced to carry heavy bricks of clay and limestone to and fro the deep underground castle from dawn until dusk, their bodies weary and their spirits broken. Under the watchful eyes of the cruel-looking guards, they worked tirelessly, their muscles straining with every step as they labored under the weight of their burdens. Often, they were given little to eat, their hunger gnawing at them as they toiled through the long, grueling days. At night, they were herded into uncomfortable shelters, their bodies bruised and battered from the day's work, only to rise before the sun to begin the cycle anew. It was a life of endless toil and suffering, with little respite and even less hope of redemption. And for Asahd, trapped in this hellish existence, the realization of his fate was a bitter pill to swallow. With a broken spirit and a heavy heart, he gave in to the harsh labor of the king's construction site, knowing that he had no other choice but to obey. Day after day, he toiled tirelessly, his body growing sluggish and weary from the endless labor. Is work really a loyal friend? He would often ask himself, his voice filled with bitterness and despair. Am I being rewarded with what I deserve? But despite his doubts and his growing sense of hopelessness, Asahd forced himself to carry on with the work. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, something might happen to change his fate. Maybe someday, he would find a way to escape this hellish existence and reclaim the freedom he so desperately desired. And so, with a heavy heart and a weary body, Asahd continued to toil aimlessly, clinging to the faint glimmer of hope that burned within him, even in the darkest of times. For in a place where hope was all but lost, it was all he had left to hold on to. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Asahd's hopes continued to fade, slowly but surely. With each passing day, he found himself sinking deeper into despair, the weight of his fate bearing down on him like a heavy chain. Maybe this is what I'm destined for, he would often say to himself, his voice filled with resignation and defeat. There seemed to be no hope of redemption in sight, no glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. His master, Kabir, was no longer the man he once was. Reduced to a shadow of his former self, Kabir could barely feed his family, let alone offer any help to Asahd. And as for his friend Badr, he had long since left their city for an unknown destination, leaving Asahd alone to face his fate. Where could redemption possibly come from? Asahd thought to himself, his heart heavy with despair. There seemed to be no escape from the harsh reality of his situation, no way out of the endless cycle of toil and suffering. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, Asahd refused to give up hope entirely. With each passing day, he pushed himself to the limit, determined to persevere against all odds, even when it seemed like there was no hope left to cling to. For in a world filled with darkness and despair, it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. On a particularly sunny day, as Asahd knelt face down, gasping for air under the scorching sun, covered from head to toe in red dust, he was suddenly summoned by the slave guard. With his body aching and his spirit broken, Asahd raised his eyes in fear, wondering what he could have possibly done wrong this time. Following the guard sheepishly, Asahd made his way to the slave registrar's chamber, his heart heavy with apprehension. But as he entered the chamber, his fear turned to shock and then to overwhelming joy. Standing before him was a middle-aged man dressed in an expensive purple linen and a scarlet silk robe. As Asahd got closer, he realized with disbelief that it was his long-lost friend, Badr. Unable to contain his excitement, Asahd rushed forward and embraced his friend, tears of joy streaming down his dusty cheeks. Badr opened his arms wide to receive his friend, despite the mud that covered Asahd's body. They hugged tightly, their tears mingling as they embraced each other for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Badr sighed in relief, his heart filled with joy at finally finding his friend after weeks of searching through countless slave markets. With his friend by his side, Badr handed a purse of silver to the registrar, who, in turn, released Asahd into his care. Asahd could hardly believe his eyes. He was finally leaving the king's dungeon, his long nightmare finally at an end. Overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, Asahd knelt at Badr's feet and wept tears of joy. Though he was now sold to another master, in the person of his friend Badr, Asahd knew that his new life would be far better than the one he had endured in the king's construction site. As he walked out of the king's construction site alongside Badr, Asahd felt a newfound sense of hope and freedom wash over him, his heart filled with gratitude for the friend who had come to his rescue in his darkest hour. In Bada's house, Asahd found himself treated not like a slave, but like a king. For the next 6 months, he lived in luxury, enjoying the finest foods and dressing in the finest clothes. Though he humbly tried to turn down some of the special treatments, Bada would always insist, saying, "Asahd, my friend, you're like a brother to me. My estate is yours. Enjoy everything I have, for you have earned it." He'd also recount many times Asahd had extended kindness and help to him during their days of slavery in Kabir's fields. And indeed, Asahd felt loved and appreciated in Bada's house, realizing just how true his friend's words were. Work had truly liberated him in an unfathomable way. During his days in the king's construction site, he never could have imagined living the life of luxury he enjoyed in Bada's house, let alone the one that lay ahead. A few days later, Bada invited him for a walk, and as they strolled through the fields, Bada showed him a large expanse of land that he was gifting to him. "I want you to cultivate this field for as long as you want," Bada said, "and use its proceeds to create an estate for yourself. Here are seedlings and farm tools, and these 2 slaves will assist you in the fields for as long as you desire." Bada pointed to a newly built castle in the distance. "There is your house," he said, "where you and your slaves will stay for as long as you desire. You are now a free man, my friend. You can live on your own terms and do whatever you desire. But do not forget work. It has brought you thus far, and it can take you further. Treat it as a friend, and it will be loyal to you. It has rewarded you. It has set you free." Overwhelmed with excitement and gratitude, Asahd acknowledged the wisdom of his friend Bada, echoing his words assuredly, "Indeed, work is a tool through which one can gain freedom." With a newfound sense of purpose and determination, Asahd forged ahead, fully aware that he had achieved everything he had by means of hard work. And with the same tool, work, he knew that he could achieve anything he set his mind to. For Asahd, true freedom had finally been attained, and the future was filled with endless possibilities. Moral of the story. The tale of Asahd and Bada teaches us that hard work and perseverance can lead to freedom and success, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Through his dedication and determination, Asahd was able to overcome the challenges of slavery and achieve true freedom, proving that work is indeed a powerful tool that can liberate us from even the darkest of circumstances.